Hey, Marshall here to tell you about an incredibly easy way anyone who loves brewing and drinking beer can save a little bit of money. In addition to supporting everything we do here at Brülosophy, the American Homebrewers Association recently introduced their free Brew Guru mobile app. It offers a searchable database of homebrew recipes, including popular craft beer clones and hundreds of award-winning recipes from the National Homebrew Competition. What's more, Brew Guru has a searchable map of deals at breweries, beer bars, and homebrew shops. Grab the free Brew Guru app for iPhone and Android devices today and follow the path to great beer. A quintessential component of styles like Amber Ale, British Bitter, and Belgian Double, and even classic American Pale Ale, among so many others, is characteristic sweetness that might range from light and sugary to rich and raisin-like. How does that get there? This is the Brülosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode, contributor and co-host Matt Del Fiacco joins me to discuss a malt that makes up a portion of the grist in myriad styles of beer.
Yeah, Marshall, today we're going to be talking about Crystal Malt, one of my favorite malts, and just because of such a wide variety of them, and it's such a huge supporting character to so many styles. It's a great thing to get to know and to learn more about, so it's been great.
Yeah, crystal malts are one of those interesting things. Back when I started brewing in 2003, it was totally normal to add upwards of 2 pounds of crystal malt as a steeping grain. I was brewing with extract back then. Yeah, a pound or two, I recall, was pretty normal to steep. And then you when you're making extract with steeping grains, just not just for the color contribution, but flavor contribution as well. And I made some pretty good beers back then. At least my memory of them was that they were pretty decent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I had the same experience. Like when I started brewing 5 or 6 years ago, talking to the local homebrew guy, which is where I got, almost all my information besides like the internet forums, is, everything had a little bit of crystal malt in it. It was a little bit of supporting character, some fuller sweetness and those kinds of things. So I don't think I brewed a style without crystal malt for a pretty long time.
Yeah, no, dude, I'm in the same boat. I honestly, I don't know if it was it must have been like 2011, 2012 where I made my first beer without a crystal malt. And I'd be lying if I said that even nowadays, even though, I haven't been using crystal malt much lately, partially because, of our experimental brewing and all of that stuff. I don't want anything to get in the way of the variables that we're testing. But, crystal malt seems to have kind of gotten a bad rap lately.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. It has. And I think it's probably one of those swinging pendulum arguments where, crystal malt started to get a little more popular and we started to add more and more of it to our beers. And as time went on, like that might have been a bit of a caricature of what that malt actually is. Yeah. And then, so now people are starting to dial it way, way back. Although, we definitely know some people who still use quite a bit of crystal malt. They like their beers, which is the important thing.
That's right.
But I think we're going to come back and find a middle ground pretty soon.
Yeah. Well, and you're referring to our friend from Brew United, Olin Suddeth, I'm sure, who is like a crystal lover, if ever there were one. But like I said, it seems like over the last 5 years or so, people have kind of taken more of a negative perspective of crystal malt. And you see in recipes, there's a lot of recipes lately that just are completely absent of crystal malt. And so in this episode, we're going to give it its fair shake. And I think it is deserving of some attention. It's a malt that I think helped to shape in many ways, many of the beers that put craft brewing, at the forefront or where it is today. So that's what this episode's about. We're going to get into the history of crystal malt, how it's made, and we're even going to discuss some experiments that we've done on crystal malt. But real quick, we've got to get to some other stuff first. We recently announced the Brew Club. It's been about a month now. It is officially a thing. You can head over to thebrewclub.com. That's thebruclub.com to learn more about it and to register to become a member. It's free, and honestly, the dudes who are running this thing are super committed to creating something really cool. Michael Ferris is kind of heading this thing up. He's the guy behind the website, and they've got some plans for that. It's going to be really neat, and they've got some cool stuff lined up. There's already, I think he was telling me, we're pushing like 200 members already, which is nuts.
It's unbelievable.
All these folks who are already talking about entering their beers into competition. Now, the main reason I bring this up right now is because we learned something about competitions recently. One of the ideas behind the Brew Club was to have members compete with beers made using less conventional or short and shoddy methods. And we made the suggestion that folks currently in other clubs that they value maybe would enter their normal beers under that club while entering their short and shoddy beers under the Brew Club. Well, what we learned was that there are like two main programs, and Matt, I know you compete a little bit more than I do. Maybe you can speak a bit to this, but there's two popular programs that competitions use for people to register their beers. One of them allows people to essentially, I think this is my understanding, per beer, you get to put what club you want that beer submitted under. So that works great, right? So if you want to submit, your really nice, 5-year-old Russian Imperial Stout or something under your normal home club, you can do that. But then you can also enter short and shoddy beers or whatever else you want under the Brew Club or some other club. So there's one of the programs allows that. What we learned is that the other program doesn't allow that. It actually attaches the club to your login, so to your email address, essentially. And unfortunately, that's the program that's used for the National Homebrew Competition.
Yeah, so that's the BCOE and M software. That's the one actually I'm most familiar with.
So I think what it is that one doesn't allow you to submit under multiple club names. You are affiliated Correct. With a single club.
Yes. So that stuff is assigned by profile. So yeah, you can only obviously register one profile unless you're doing multiple emails and you swing it in a weird way. But yeah, it is tied to your profile. So one club.
Yeah. So if you plan to enter beers in an HC, they'll have to be under a single club. So just be aware of that when you are signing up. If you want to do the Brew Club, more power to you. That's awesome. If not, no hard feelings. You can still be a part of the Brew Club. And, no one ever said you can't be a part of two clubs. So yeah, again, just be aware of that. We don't want you accidentally putting the Brew Club when you meant to submit it under your home club, if that's what you want to do. And the National Homebrew Competition, where the winners are announced.
So the NHC winners are obviously announced at the end of Homebrew Con, which this year is going to be in Portland,
Oregon. And I am super stoked for this one. We want to remind everyone that this is going to be a fun event, as it always is. It's from June 28th to June 30th in Portland, Oregon. Homebrewers from around the world are going to be hanging out. We've even got our friends from New Zealand, the guys who organized the New Zealand Homebrewers Conference, which I had the fortune to go out and be a part of last year. They're going to be hanging out. I think they're actually bringing the Brewmania winner or something like that to HomebrewCon. There's going to be all sorts of cool people just hanging out, drinking beer, partaking in all of the crazy festivities, learning, so much information about brewing and beer. And on top of that, we're going to be partying with the folks from Yakima Valley Hops, Mecca Great Estate Malt, and Imperial Yeast at our huge expo booth. This thing's going to be nuts. The AHA is working with us to create something completely unique. We were all recently on a call where we talked about the beers that we plan to serve at this booth. And given the experimental nature of what it is we're going to be doing, I can't really divulge much, but I can tell you that it's going to be fun. It's going to be just as educational as it is tasty. We're going to be recording a couple episodes live from the conference, and Jersey and Tim are going to be there doing reviews. You don't want to miss it. If you're not already an AHA member, go sign up now. You can head over to brulosophy.com/AHA so you can become a member. And that's how you're able to register for HomebrewCon 2018 in Portland, Oregon. I am so excited. You know what else I'm excited about, Matt?
What are you excited about, Marshall?
I'm excited about Imperial Yeast new packaging. Matt, have you seen these things yet? The pictures of these new packages yet?
I have. I saw the video they posted on Facebook of one of them getting filled, and I cannot wait.
Yeah. These things are so cool. I love how each style of yeast has its own color now. So you've got different colors for ale, lager, Belgian strains, all that stuff. I think they're going with purple for wild, funky strains, Brettanomyces, stuff like that. I mean, I love the cans, but I think the pitch-right pouches will probably be more user-friendly and hopefully make their way into more homebrew shops around the world. Imperial Yeast packs 200 billion cells into each pitch-right pouch, over double what most other yeast labs include, and their cultures are guaranteed to be fresh and ready to turn your wort into delicious beer. I've got a Pilsner fermenting right now with L13 Global Yeast, which I believe people kind of say is like the Weihenstephan strain. I pitched a starter at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm going all traditional here. That's 9 degrees C, and had Kreuzen formation in just 8 hours. That's how great this stuff is. They're a rad company. I'm really proud, to endorse them. Brülosophy loves Imperial. Check out what Imperial Yeast has to offer over at imperialyeast.com. Their product is currently available at More Beer and Great Fermentations, both of which we have links to over at brülosophy.com/support. Hey, check it out. If you want to be a participant in the crazy experiments and whatnot that we do, and you live in any of the following cities, reach out to me, Marshall at brülosophy.com, and I'll put you in touch with the contributor that lives nearest you. I'm right here in Fresno, California, and we've got folks in Anchorage, Alaska, Corona, California, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Pueblo, Colorado, Denver, Colorado, and Matt lives in Chicago, Illinois. Our Pittsburgh contributor will soon be moving to Atlanta, Georgia, so if you live there and you want to participate, feel free to reach out, and I'll put you in touch with Malcolm. If you have any questions for our Brew and A episodes, you can email them to me, Marshall at brülosophy.com, or you can drop them on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or any of the other online forums we frequent. We've actually got one coming up in a couple episodes. So, all right, we got some feedback. Most of the feedback that we got recently is from our episode on New England style IPA, particularly the grains. It's funny because the feedback that we got doesn't really have much to do with grains, but it has to do with other stuff. So here's the first one, Matt. I'm curious to see what you think about this. Will Allwart from Facebook, he left the comment on Facebook, says, after listening to the podcast and later pulling some 2-day-old guacamole out of the fridge, it led me to a conclusion. The fast oxidation rate in New England IPA must be from the high fat content and percentage of oats in most any IPA. I'm going to say that this is a hypothesis, not so much a conclusion, but combine that with all the late hop additions, and it's pretty much a recipe for guacamole. It's great fresh, but rancid and brown 2 days later.
I love the analogy. I think that's fantastic. I think there's something to be said for it. Like we've definitely been able to observe some pretty visible changes that would, in theory, be the result of oxidation in those IPAs. And I think that's a fair assumption that there's some kind of lipid contribution from the grains that are being used, or the excessive amount of hops might contribute. I know the theory that we've been talking about recently, or the hypothesis, I guess, is the contribution of like manganese and other metals in those oxidizing characters. So I don't know. I think it's a sound assumption.
My understanding, and I'm not a food scientist necessarily, so I could be wrong, but my understanding that with guacamole turning brown is that that's a process of enzymatic browning or something like that. And so I'm not so, it could, maybe perhaps that's playing a role in this crazy weird color change that we're seeing in New England IPA. And I've seen, somebody commented that, Treehouse is a huge, they're known for their New England IPA, their hazy IPA. And I was after we released this episode, somebody emailed me saying that they've opened cans of Treehouse IPA and had it go within 2 weeks and it's brown or purplish. So it's really interesting. That was the other bit of feedback that we got. I actually, on my notes, I wrote numerous users, from forums, because people commented a ton on this. There seems to be a bunch of speculation, many involving oxidation, about this color change. Some of them, like you mentioned, Matt, there's this idea that trace metals that are present in hops and flaked oats are contributing to this, quick, I don't want to call it oxidation. I keep saying color change because that's really what it is. But I've noticed in my experience that when that color change occurs, it also has a very noticeable flavor change as well.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it's a good sign that, like, obviously something chemically is going on in that beer, for sure. Like there's some kind of change.
Yeah.
But I think you raise a good point that there's a lot that contributes to color changes and flavor changes that aren't oxidation. Like obviously enzymatic browning during the boiling process. Like we have the Maillard reactions. So obviously that's probably not what's going on in here, but at the same time, there's definitely other contributing factors. But I lean towards the possible oxidation, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of in this, my kind of working hypothesis right now is that oxygen plays a role, but that it's not solely responsible for this problem.
Sure.
And the reason I think that is, I've made numerous styles of beer, pale lagers all the way through standard APA, American Pale Ale. And I've kegged them using less than, good practices. I'll admit it, like, splashing the wort down into the beer. And I don't observe this change. Yet in almost every New England IPA that I've made, and what we're seeing all over the internet right now, these beers seem to be hypersensitive to oxidation, but there's got to be a reason for it. And so I think the real culprit might be, these trace metals, in particular manganese, which, we plan to test out in various ways. In fact, I'm looking at pure manganese. I've been looking online to see if maybe dosing a beer, we could create this issue. So anyways, like I said, we've got a whole bunch of stuff planned to continue testing this out. We want to figure out just as much as anyone else, not only the main causes of haze and that juicy character in any IPA, but why this weird thing continues to happen. So thanks to all the people who gave that feedback. We engaged in quite a few in pretty wordy conversations after that episode dropped.
Yeah, definitely.
If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast or left a review, please go do that. We really do appreciate it. If you want to help us to continue bringing you this podcast, as well as all the experimental stuff we're doing at the website, you can head over to brülosophy.com/support, where we have links you can bookmark and use to a bunch of great places you're already shopping at for gear and ingredients. It's probably the most innocuous way to support us that really does help out a ton. If you want to be rewarded with something a little more tangible for supporting us, head over to patreon.com/Brülosophy, where for as little as $1 a month, you'll receive never before published Brülosophy recipe, get access to a private brew crew forum, receive unique discounts to Yakima Valley hops, and so much more. In fact, one of our new rewards for 2018 is a monthly Q&A livecast with a special guest. You get this for committing to a $3 per month pledge. And this month, our guest is none other than Michael Tonsmeyer, the guy who wrote American Sour Beers and blogs at themadfermentationist.com. He's also in the middle of opening a brewery with our friend Scott Janish called Sapwood Cellars. So he'll be able to take your questions about all of that stuff, from going pro to brewing any IPA and brewing sour beers. It's going to be great. Rewards for January have already been distributed, so unfortunately this is now closed. But if you become a patron and you shoot me an email, I'm sure we can work something out. If you don't want to miss future Q&A livecasts, make sure to become a patron now. We've got some fantastic guests lined up. Again, that's patreon.com/Brülosophy. Matt, how do you feel about fruited beers?
I don't like fruited beers. And I know that a lot of people are really all about it. I tend to dislike beers that are fruited, just usually not really my thing. So I am not a fan.
So either am I. I am a beer flavored beer guy. And I like to think of myself as being adventurous and liking unique things. However, I know people like their fruited beers, and when it comes to beer, I'm just not a fan. Well, our friend Will Watson, also known as Hi Hat Brewing, sent me a cherry Maibach that, of course, I shared with my friends.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
We are going to do this review with only terms from drag racing. It seems to me that this has got a good quarter mile. I smell nothing.
Nothing.
Ooh, I do not like it.
I don't mind it.
Why do we always do this? We're supposed to have the same palate. You like this?
It's got fruit to it.
Fruit to it, huh? You've made another bold claim that I don't know if we can back up. I'll buy that. I think it's got some fruit in there. But you know what? I bet it doesn't.
What I like about it is it's not staying in my mouth forever. I hate that. Say what you will. I actually like this. It's very good.
Hang on. But you're always the voice of reason. If you like something, I'm going to take another drink and just make sure, because I'm surprised. I'll tell you that. Yeah, you're right. It's not bad. It's different, but at the same time, I could see myself acting like I really like this to impress people. Like, you got to try this beer, dude. It's got tones of undertones and some overtones.
I'm not in love with it, but it's very good.
How many Timmy Jersey's are we going to give it?
Whatever. I'm going to go with the 6.
6 Timmy Jersey's? Yeah. I'll give it 2 Timmy Jersey's. That puts it in 8.
I have to be honest. I thought it was pretty funny that in this one, Tim was the one who seemed to like the beer right off the bat and was able to nail it as being kind of fruity. I've had Maibach in the past that has no fruit in it, that I still kind of get kind of a not cherry thing, but a little bit of a fruity thing going on, I think, just from that high alcohol. But they ended up both, I guess, liking it enough. So good job, Will. I'm looking at my notes now. And the beer was, for being a fruited beer, it was pretty good. He used 2.5 pounds of, it looks like cherries, that he tossed into his primary for 9 days, and then 6 drops of cherry extract into each bottle. This was a 3-gallon batch, OG of 1065, FG of 1011 for an ABV of 7.1%. Whoo, doggy. Pretty standard grist. But I was drinking this, and the cherry flavor that I got, I was pretty sure came from the extract. It didn't seem to have a really strong, like, fresh cherry flavor. I've made ciders that have frozen cherries in it that have that kind of more earthy cherry thing going on. This had more of that kind of cherry candy type of thing, but it was subtle. It wasn't in your face cherry. And the Maibach, I thought, was brewed well. It was a clean lager beer. He fermented it at looks like 53 degrees with popular 3470 lager yeast strain. Good job, Will. We've got some more beers that he sent us that will be coming up on review here very soon. Some of them pretty unique. If you'd like to have your beer featured on the 1 Minute Beer Review with Jersey and Tim, you can email me, Marshall@Brülosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. All right, we've got to head to a break, and when we come back, we're going to be digging into everything that is crystal malt. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewer's Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brülosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's brew.com. The best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Find everything from classics to modern favorites, as well as cool experimental varieties and a vast array of ingredients and gear at yakimavalleyhops.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste time chilling work, which is why I use cleverly designed immersion chillers from Jaded Brewing. After some bad experiences with counterflow and plate chillers, I began the search for a more efficient chilling solution and discovered Jaded. That was nearly 4 years ago, and to this day, I continue to rely on the King Cobra and the Hydra to chill my wort in record time without the setup or cleaning hassle of other chillers. If you're looking for a way to optimize your brew day, I can't recommend Jaded chillers enough. Go see what they have to offer at jadedbrewing.com and let them know Brülosophy sent you. Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brülosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at breweries across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to Brülosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member. Base malts have been around for a long time, and the history of crystal malt's a pretty interesting one because it came a bit after the fact, as a sort of we don't call it an adjunct nowadays, but sort of an addition to beer to impart different types of character to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's pretty interesting because we don't know obviously a ton of when crystal malt was first used, at least from what I've been able to find. But Ron Pattinson of the Shut Up About Barclay Perkins blog seems to suggest that it's at least been being used as early as the beginning of the 1900s. So it's pretty likely it's been around for a little bit earlier than that. And it was pretty limited at the time. It contributed, a little more of that fuller character. It was said to, just a deeper color for the beer, better overall flavor. But it wasn't until after World War I and then World War II that it saw kind of increasing usage in milds and bitters and things like that.
It's interesting for me to think about the kind of the genesis of crystal malt. And real quick, just to get it out there, we haven't addressed it yet. Crystal malt is often used interchangeably with caramel malt, and there's some caramel malt is a product of Briess, which is here in the United States, and crystal malt is what they refer to.
Well, it's actually a little interesting. Basically, like in the industry, it seems to be that there is a difference between crystal and caramel malts. We do tend to use them pretty interchangeably in brewing. And pro brewers I've talked to, I had to double check with this with some of my pro brewing friends, and then some other home brewers. Like, we tend to use caramel and crystal malts really interchangeably, and you'll see that in some of the malting houses as well, that they'll use them pretty interchangeably. Some of the Briess malt sheets actually also have it used interchangeably, where they'll say caramel malt for something that traditionally, and something that they talk about before on other podcasts, like Bob Hansen and Cassie Liscombe were on the Master Brewers podcast, and they talked about crystal malt and caramel malts and those differences. So it seems to be a little bit of confusion, but in theory, they are separate. They are different things.
Okay, so there's a distinction, but they're used similarly. They have kind of a similar role when it comes to brewing. So it's interesting to me when kind of considering the history of crystal malt, that at some point in time, it sounds like what you're saying was early 20th century, maybe late 19th century. Some, really smart maltster out there, or maybe it was a brewer, had this idea to take a base malt and do something different with it that created what is now just a completely normal, brewing ingredient.
Yeah, definitely. It baffles me. And it definitely wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility for that time period to have that malt made in-house. And so some brewer experimenting and doing that. But of course, obviously could also be a malt house for sure.
Yeah. So what makes crystal malt different than, say, a base malt?
So great question. So the crystal malt basically is made in a similar process to the base malt initially. During that malting process, barley gets soaked, which we call is, the process of germination. And that goal is just to produce enzymes that will eventually be converted during the mash, and they'll help break down starches to convert all that to sugar. For a pale malt, after that germination period, it'll be dried and lightly kilned, and it'll stop that process. So you'll have those enzymes in the grain, you'll have your starches, and later on it'll be mashed. Crystal malts are kept wet and then heated to sack temperatures. So basically, for crystal malts, we end up mashing those sugars within the grain. They get converted, effectively packing that grain with sugar. So that's why a crystal malt can be steeped. That conversion process has already taken place. So after that conversion has taken place, and we have all of those sugars packed in the grain, they get roasted for a period of time and at a certain humidity in order to cause different reactions. So there's going to be some enzymatic browning, there's going to be some Maillard reactions, and then you're going to get a range of crystal malts from something like Crystal 10L, which is going to contribute much lighter sweetness to it. A lot more like really light caramel, all the way up to something like Crystal 160L, which is going to contribute a lot more like dark fruit and burnt sugar. And then at the end of the day, you have this spectrum of malts that all have their sugars converted within the grain.
And that's the key. And this is the part that I just love about there's so many things in brewing that I just think are so cool.
Absolutely.
But crystal malts, in essence, what it boils down to is that crystal malts, that starch inside the grain, inside of a regular old malt, has already been converted into a sweet sugar. It doesn't require the enzymatic change that a base malt does in order to convert that into sugar, right?
Yep, that's it. And that would actually be one of the in theory, differences between crystal and caramel malt, where a caramel malt necessarily might not be able to be steeped. Those sugars wouldn't necessarily be converted.
Right.
But crystal malt, it's all packed in the grain. All that mashing has taken place. This is why you'll see it so often where extract brewers will steep their crystal malts at around like 150 or 150 degrees Fahrenheit in order to saturate the water with the sugars from those malt or from that grain, and it's already all done.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because crystal malts are also said to be largely non-fermentable. I think a lot of people view it that way, despite the fact that it is sweet. What's the story behind that? Why do so many people view crystal malts as imparting unfermentable sugars?
So part of the point of like these malts, and you'll see this more in like the carapils and the carafoam, is that they're high dextrin malts from this process, that they contribute a lot of body, And I think it comes from the fact that we get a lot of those sugars that have gone through like the caramelization process. They're not going to be as fermentable. The dextrins for sure should leave more body in your beer, depending on like your usage. I think it's a combination of those two things. You get a little more flavor from them. You get a little more color. You get a little more body. And so obviously there is some lending of non-fermentable sugars, but there are definitely still fermentable sugars as well. Like there's 100% going to contribute some kind of gravity to your beer.
Yeah. So interesting thing. I was just reminded of this. I think back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, someone posted on Homebrew Talk a cool experiment they did where they essentially, I believe they made a whole bunch of small 100% crystal malt mashes and then tried to ferment them and found that they actually fermented. I can't speak to the exactness of this, but they actually did ferment a fair degree, more than this person expected at the very least. So there are fermentable sugars coming from crystal malts. Perhaps not as much as you're going to get from a base malt or something like that.
Right.
But it's a great grain, and we all use it. There are certain styles, in my opinion, that you have to include crystal malt in. For example, I was just drinking a Flipside red IPA from Sierra Nevada, and then over the holidays, everyone was drinking Celebration Ale from Sierra Nevada. Those beers couldn't exist. They wouldn't have the character that they do without crystal malt. And I believe they're using something like a 60 Lovabond to get that nice red color and those flavors into the beer. So it is an important malt in brewing and beer. I want to loop back around to something else I think is interesting that I know we've already addressed a little bit, and that's the difference between crystal malt and caramel malt. And really what people are referring to there is US crystal malt versus UK crystal malt. And there, I don't know if the claims that I've heard are that, the crystal malts that you're going to get from the UK, so Baird's and Crisp and all of that stuff, tend to impart a more full, toasty, characteristic that people would generally say is better and certainly more appropriate for styles like ESB or bitter. While US caramel malt or US crystal malt imparts kind of a thinner, sweeter characteristic that's not necessarily preferred in those more kind of warm English styles.
Absolutely. I see that all the time. It's discussed in like some of the standard homebrewing literature. Like I think Randy Mosher talks about that in Radical Brewing a little bit. And it's something that I believed for a super long time. I mean, a couple of years. Something we need to consider is that all of the maltsters are going to make that in a little bit of a separate way, so they're all going to have some different character. But it's a really common thing that UK crystal malts are going to have like a fuller, better, better with quotation marks around it, character than the US crystal.
I feel like in brewing, America's got a bunch of homebrewers. We probably have the biggest, population of homebrewers in the world in this country. And I feel like maybe not even just with brewing, but particularly in homebrewing, that there's this kind of like, if it comes from America, it's not as good a quality as if you get continental, for example, continental Pilsner malt or, UK crystal malts or whatever it is. And I have no opinion about that. It's just an observation I've made that I think is kind of interesting, that we really sort of laud these ingredients that come from different regions of the world that aren't here in the U.S. Though I would contend that I think there's a lot of love given to American hops, but we've developed most of those popular hops these days, so anyways, just an observation I've made. Let's talk a little bit about these different levels of kilning and in particular the comparison between UK and US crystal varieties, because I know that we kind of rate them a little bit differently.
Yeah. So when we talk about crystal malts, like we usually distinguish them by their color. And definitely in the US, we tend to use Lavabond, which is a different scale used to measure just beer color and used to sort of make that distinction.
My understanding is that Lavabond is used to measure the color of a grain, right? And then you've got SRM is typically used for beer color.
So Lavabond is the color of grains, and SRM and EBC are just beer color.
Cool. And so EBC, we don't want to spend too much time on this, but EBC is used in most of Europe. I know it's what they go by in New Zealand and Australia as well. And it's going to say that's sort of the they're saying if you use this grain, this is the color you can expect in the finished beer, whereas Lavabond is the color.
It's your expected contribution to the finished beer.
Right. Okay. Cool.
And so, like based off of those color ranges, whether you're using Lavabond, whether you're using EBC, we tend to make those distinctions like a low kilning, a medium kilning, and a high kilning. the low kilning, which is, somewhere in the range of 10 to 25 to 30 lava bond, are going to be frequently found in things like pilsners or pale ale. It's a staple in pale ales, especially American pale ales. And it also encompasses that dextrin malt family, just for body and supposedly head retention, but then contributes. It's going to contribute like a lighter sweetness to beers, ranging from something like caramel to toffee, and can tend to be a pretty large portion of the grist, based on the style that you're going after.
Yeah, relative to the other amounts of the other grains that are in there. You can. I've seen these light crystal malts, which is how you're going to see them referred to, I think, by most UK maltsters. Is they clump all of these lower level bond crystal malts into light, I believe. But those are going to get used in these beers. I've seen them used upwards of 10-15% even, without really imparting a terribly cloying or sweet characteristic.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of that next step up is what would be referred to as the medium crystal, which is a medium kilning, somewhere around the range of like 30, 35 to maybe 80-ish lava bond, are going to be obviously those darker grains, and just based on that, increased Maillard reactions, increased enzymatic browning. These malts are just going to be a little more full in caramel character. They're going to have more of that caramelization character you would expect from that process. So there might be they're perceived maybe as a little more richer, and you start to get into that dark fruit and burnt sugar character that darker malts are going to provide a lot more of. And those malts, crystal malts, are what I see used most often. They're used a ton in things like stouts and browns and milds and porters, where it's pretty much required to have some kind of a crystal malt.
These medium kilned crystal malts are really neat to me, because you can use a very small amount to impart some flavor to a beer, but they're perfect for color adjustment as well. You look at something like I have a Tiny Bottom pale ale recipe. It's just a nice, simple, clean pale ale, not too hoppy, but it has a small portion of Crystal 60, I believe, that I use in it, just to give it that kind of pale ale color that's not quite orange, but not pale straw, and I haven't compared it, but I do think that it also imparts kind of a nice, rich background to that malt character that I really enjoy. So these are popular. This range of malts seem really popular, and like you said, Matt, they're used in a ton of different styles of beer.
Yeah, absolutely. I see them all over the place, and it's probably the one I use the most frequently. But so the next step up, kind of mentioned before, is going to be like that really, that dark malt, the highly kilned malt, which enters like, that 90 to 160 lava bond area, pretty much anything before we get into the no man's land of lava bond, where, that's going to be things like some pale chocolates are in there where it's like supposed to be like cigarette ash character.
Yeah.
But a little lower than that is going to be like the last of those crystal malts, which are going to contribute a lot more heavy dark fruit, a lot more caramel, and then, burnt sugar. And that's really widely used in things like stouts, old ales, barley wines, Belgian dark strongs, things where that stuff is all desirable. But almost always you're going to see this in a much lower percentage than something like the low lava bond crystal malts, usually around 5% or less, and even that might be pushing it for some people.
It can be, that even at 5%, you're going to taste this.
Definitely.
I think we've all maybe in our earlier brewing days maybe had a heavy hand with the C120 or something like Special B, which Special B would be kind of the highest end of the crystal range and is used in Belgian double and all sorts of Belgian beers, but a little 2% of Special B in even a pale beer is going to give you a characteristic, I'm pretty sure, that you can taste.
And some color, for sure.
Yeah, it's going to add color. It's going to add that. I get, in higher amounts, I get a real kind of pruny, plum, kind of pruny type of flavor from these darker crystal malts.
Yeah, same.
So, definitely you want to practice, moderation when using these darker crystal malts. I forget who it was. I think it might have been our friend Chino who made like a 100% Special B beer, and believe he shared that with us at HomebrewCon.
It was. Yeah, it was Chino. I don't know if it was 50 or if it was 100. but it was a lot.
It wasn't good. I mean, I told him that straight to his face. The beer tasted like crap, but not that it was poorly made, but you don't want to make a beer with 100% special B or even 50% if that's what he did.
Yeah. And just to throw a little bit of a little better for Chino's Way, I'm guilty of making an 80% pale chocolate beer before. And while I'm confident that beer was well made, it for sure missed the mark, and it was disgusting. It tasted like raw coffee. It was bad.
Ugh, gross. Well, the last thing we're going to hit on is there are some issues. I think part of what contributes to, or what has contributed to crystal malts kind of falling out of favor recently, is that there are some hypotheses as to some issues that the use of crystal malts might lead to. One of the ones that I heard is that it can easily lead to, it can actually encourage quicker oxidation in beer. That when you use crystal malt, those beers tend to oxidize quicker for some reason.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one of the ones I've been hearing more frequently recently, as we've been like having that discussion, and it's a little bit of yes and no, at least based on the research I've been able to do. And probably one of the best things that encapsulates the research done in that area is by Carvello et al. It's called Overall Antioxidant Properties of Malt. They talk specifically about crystal malt, but there's a lot of other research out there. So, it's a little bit give and take, where there is obviously antioxidant properties in malt for sure. Malt has a lot of antioxidant stuff that actually gets built a little bit more during the malting process, which is great. And this is likely to come just from the fact that during the malting process, those antioxidant properties are developed by the Maillard reaction products and reductones, which result in better antioxidant properties in beer. Unfortunately, there's also some research that says that darker malts have a higher distribution of free radicals. So free radicals being just highly reactive highly reactive oxidants. And during the process of getting darker, those contributions can be widely more distributed in the grain, where in a lighter kilned malt, they might be a little more limited to the husk. So they're going to be more in the resulting beer. So there's a little bit of yes, there's a little more oxidant properties from the malt. There's a little bit of no, like there's better antioxidant properties. So it ends up being, I don't want to say a wash, but definitely not as easy a picture to paint as we try to make it.
Yeah. Whenever anybody's like, use too much crystal malt, this is going to oxidize. Now I'm going to go tell them to listen to you talk about that, because that was interesting. I'm glad you did all that research.
I wouldn't quite tell them that, but at the very least, there is a lot of research out there that they can look into, and if they want to email me, I would love to learn more about it and to discuss it with them.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I've made beers with a pound of 5 gallon batch with a pound of crystal malt and not noticed it go oxidize any quicker. Another thing that I've heard, and this is just complete conjecture at this point. I Googled it and I couldn't find anything. Is that the use of crystal malt will again kind of quicken the time that it takes for hop character to drop out of beer. So if you have like a pale ale without crystal malt and you make the same beer but with a dose of crystal malt replacing the base malt, that one with crystal malt, the hop character is going to deplete faster than the other one. I don't know how that would happen, but I have heard that, and I think the main thing with crystal malt, the big thing against it, is that if you use too much, your beer's not going to attenuate very well, because it is going to impart these longer chain dextrins that don't necessarily ferment very easily, even though it does impart some fermentability. The beer could be too sweet and cloying and icky gross. But those are the main things I've heard against crystal malt. And yet, still people are talking bad about it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to be said in terms of things to be maybe cautious of, or things just to be aware of when you're doing some recipe construction, or things you want to test yourself. I'd like to do some more with crystal malt. I think it'd be tons of fun, but I think there's nothing to say that crystal malt inherently is going to do anything bad to your beer, especially when used somewhat appropriately in terms of just testing it out, because it's a staple of a lot of styles.
When we come back from this short break, we're going to be digging into some experiments that we've actually done focusing on crystal malt. When dumping wort-soaked grain in leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead?
Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
So this whole kind of argument that, UK Crystal Malt produces a more or higher quality beer than, US Crystal Malt got me thinking, got me really interested. And like I mentioned, this idea that we have to get our ingredients, from different countries if we really want to make the best beer. It inspired me to experiment with this. And so what I did is I brewed two of the same beers using different crystal malts for an experiment. The beer was a standard pale ale, hopped very, very lightly with Citra at the end. It wasn't, the Citra didn't come through. I say that because people complained about it, but I used an ounce of Citra in the whole batch, so it's not a big deal. Let's see. I used the percentage of crystal malt was about 9%, so I didn't go nuts on it. And what I compared was U.S. Caramel 60, so C60, very popular, gives a nice red hue when used at certain amounts, to a medium crystal from the UK. I believe it was Baird's the crystal malt that I used. Made the beers exactly the same, treated them the same. They were both brewed with all of the same processes and methods. And the OGs on the beers came out about the same. The UK Crystal Malt, the Baird's, was 1052 OG, whereas the US Crystal Malt beer was at 1053. I'm going to say that's a wash. That could just be normal variability. Both beers were fermented with Saf Ale US05 that I rehydrated. Actually, I think I made vitality starters with it. And then they were both fermented at the same temperature next to each other in the same chamber. And both of them finished at the same exact finishing gravity of 1008. When they were done, I cold crashed. I fined them both with gelatin. I kegged them up and I carbonated them to the same amount. Okay, so I served these beers. I served triangle tests to 22 participants, which would require 11 of them to make the correct selection in order for us to say that the beers were reliably distinguishable to a statistically significant level. But in the end, only 9 of my testers were capable of telling these beers apart. Now, before we get into my how I performed on this, I was fascinated by the responses that I got from people after doing the triangle test, and I would reveal the variable to them. Because most of the people that we have doing, at least for me, most of the people who are doing the experiments tend to be homebrewers or, learned, craft beer drinkers. And when I told them this thing, and a lot of them hold this idea that, UK Crystal Malt is just vastly different than US Crystal Malt. The beers looked exactly the same. I think one of them might have been a little bit hazier than the other. But that, to me, they look the same. So they are the same color. but people could not tell them apart with any confidence. And those who did get it right weren't able to distinguish which beer. Most of them told me, I don't know, I just guessed, and weren't able to select the beer when I would tell them, okay, one of these was made with UK Crystal and the other with US. Which one do you think is which? It was just random selections. Pretty interesting. So, Matt, I know this one kind of struck you as
yeah. Obviously, like I've said before, this is a belief that I've held for a really long time, and still hold on to a little bit. I think more out of desperation than anything else. But I remember when this got published. This was a little bit before I joined the Brülosophy crew, and I just remember being baffled by this because I did a lot of beers that were, all Simpsons UK Crystal, versus, like Brees, and was just convinced that they were different. And I was so sure that they were different. And I've never done a triangle on it. It's definitely something that I want to explore more, but it baffled me at the time. And I remember I dropped into okay, well, what was wrong with this experiment? What can I find here that invalidates this research? Because I just cannot believe that it was different. And that one blew me away.
Yeah. I have the as the brewer of this one, I was biased, and I was with you. I was never a big believer that they were different, but I sort of trusted what other people said. And I'll be honest, I'd never used, at least as far as I knew, I'd never used UK Crystal before. I always just bought the stuff that, that I'd get at More Beer or at my local homebrew shop, which I'm pretty sure is US, it's less expensive at least. I think I did 4 triangle tests on these ones, and they were just completely random guesses. I think I got 1 right, maybe 2. But these beers tasted exactly the same. And I remember drinking them side by side, biased as I was, looking at these things and just saying that these are no different. These are the same beer. So, those were the results from that one. I knew you were going to be shocked, Matt. I was surprised. Again, I trusted these people and their experiences, but it just goes to show that when you pit one thing next to another, despite your beliefs, when you don't know, what the difference is, sometimes it's a lot harder to tell them apart.
Yeah, most definitely. I agree entirely. And it's something to point out. Definitely, these maltsters will almost certainly have different processes for making these malts, different amounts of humidity, different temperatures for getting there, different process. Obviously, probably different different green barley, different crop. But obviously, just as a result of this, that even if they are different that way, that's not different enough to produce such a big difference, and it's crazy to me.
Yeah, a noticeable difference at the very least.
Right.
Well, another thing that homebrewers, we used to get this question, and in fact we still do, and I get to send them a link now, but that people ask about is, okay, let's say I run out of Crystal 60. But I have some darker crystal malt and some lighter crystal malt. Well, can I blend those to create my own Crystal 60? I think it's a really cool question. I think it's a neat idea. And our contributor Jake actually put this one to the test.
He tested that difference between a beer made with Crystal 60 and a beer made with kind of a 50-50 blend of Crystal 100 Lava Bond and Crystal 20 Lava Bond, and those were actually it was a bitter. It was about 17% of his total grain bill. So much higher than I would typically use or that I see commonly used.
Yeah, he pushed this one to the limits, and that was
for sure.
That was a part of the plan, because we had done this other experiment, and people were saying, well, maybe you just can't taste it because it was only 9%. So he went 17% on this bad boy.
Yep. And so in his results, 24 people participated in his triangle tests, which means we would have needed about 13 people to answer correctly to reach significance, and 15 people were able to do so.
So what does that say?
I think it says that a beer made with that blend is somewhat reliably distinguishable from a beer made with just Crystal 60. They were actually split on the preference of those beers, which is really interesting, which it comes down to that they probably just contributed different flavors. That Crystal 100L, like we talked about before, roasted a lot higher, goes through more caramelization, so it might contribute more of just the dark fruit character, where if you're just to blend them, you're not just blending those two malts back down to the Crystal 60L. They actually do have different different things available to them, different things in the grain available to the wort that's going to contribute something different.
Yeah.
But the preference was split. It's not to say that one was better than the other.
Yeah. So I love this experiment. And here's why I love this one. I have heard so many times from people who say, Crystal 60 is just a blend of these malts. So they're not really making this C60. What they're doing is blending something like C100 and C10 to make C60. And that's what you're getting and all of these different, crystal malts are various proportions of these, of like two main malts dude, if any, this experiment says to me, it doesn't prove anything. We're not going to go down that line of thinking, but
sure.
It totally demonstrates that Crystal 60, all of these malts were from the same maltster. They were all from Briess. That Crystal 60 imparts a unique flavor and perhaps aroma and mouthfeel as compared to a blend of C100 and C20. Again, preference was split. The participants who got it right, it's not like one of the beers was any better than the other. But I love the fact that doing something like this, using a malt at a proportion where people might say, oh, this would be an easy one to not be able to tell apart. People were able to tell it apart,
and Jake himself said that he preferred the blend, and that, what really put him over the edge in distinguishing those beers was the dark fruit character that he found in the blended beer. So it just kind of lends to the credit that if that 60L was a blend of like Crystal 120, you'd think it would contribute more.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Matt, what are your thoughts on Crystal Malt? How are you going to use them in your brewing nowadays after discussing these wonderful experiments that we've done?
Yeah, so Crystal Malt before and after these has a huge role in my brewing process. Like a lot of the beers that I use, even my Pilsner uses like a Carahel, which is a caramel malt, and I'm actually having a somewhat hard time thinking about beers that I usually wouldn't put it in unless it was for an experiment where, we don't want something to contribute to throw off sensory for something else. But I think I'm honestly, like, I still have like I said, I hold a little bit of the belief that UK is going to be somewhat different. But I also have come, like, I'm not stressing about it. I used to make sure that I ordered Simpsons UK every time, or I would get Muttons. I'm a little not as worried about it now. So if the homebrew shop I go to only has Briess or only has a US Crystal, then I think that's going to be great. Like I don't think it's going to be a huge determining factor in whether that beer is going to be a success or failure. I think if that's our concern, we have other areas we can look at.
Yeah, totally. And the thing is, I've never been like a big lover of UK malts over US malts. I never really thought about it, but for me, I've got buckets of Crystal Malt sitting on my, my malt shelf outside in my garage. And so for me, I don't use much Crystal Malt anymore these days. And I think a part of that is a function of the fact that I really like simple beers. I've really gotten into, making Pilsner and Helles and Vienna, and you don't really need much Crystal Malt in those. So that being said, I still think that it's a necessity in certain types of beers. And I have a bitter brew day planned where I'm definitely going to be using some Crystal Malt. So that's my stance. That's where I'm at. If you want to read more about these experiments, the ones that we discussed today, you can find them and so much more over at Brülosophy.com.
The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit Patreon.com/Brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.